All right, so I think we'll get going now. I think we're hitting 1:30. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Gina Almasan. I'm the dietitian at the IBD Center of BC. Some of you may have heard of the center, but we're relatively new and we're a team of gastroenterologists, IBD nurses, dietitians, and a counselor as well. All right, so diving in, just want to do a disclaimer to mention that anything I say today is not to replace any individualized advice you've been given from a dietitian or other healthcare provider. In terms of questions, hopefully there will be a good chunk of time at the end of my presentation today for questions, as well as at the Q&A panel at the end of today as well. So we'll kind of just run through everything and then do questions at the end. So today we'll be covering why nutrition is important in the first place, going over some common food triggers, strategies to optimize nutrition, as well as hydration, and then talking briefly about some popular diets for IBD, supplements that may help, and then non-dietary approaches that might be more suitable in some situations. So this talk is primarily focused on times of flare-up. Some of the things might apply though to times of remission as well, and also might be relevant for people just newly diagnosed or who have had it for many, many years but are experiencing more symptoms. All right, so why is nutrition important? So getting adequate nutrition during an IBD flare is important for many different reasons, including to support healing of the gut. So some nutrients are needed in higher amounts during a flare, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail about towards the end of this presentation. And this is especially the case if absorption is impaired because of either having had resections or active inflammation in the bowel. Nutrition is also important to try to minimize weight loss, which can be really, really common in times of flare-up if someone's restricting their diet or eating a lot less than normal. And then lastly, it can also help prevent malnutrition, which can actually in itself impair immune function, as well as it can actually impact response to certain medications. In particular types of biologics might not be quite as effective, or the duration might not be as long the patient can adequately respond to that medication for if they're very malnourished. Understandably, it can be really challenging, though, for patients to get enough nutrition during flares, as many people do have active symptoms that can interfere with intake. So this presentation will be focused on giving you strategies to optimize nutrition while trying to minimize symptoms. So everyone is quite unique in what triggers their individual symptoms. So what might trigger yours might be different from the next person. So I want to first say I would be quite cautious of information you read online recommending, strict diets of like, don't have this and this and this, based on someone's own personal experience, because that might not directly apply to your own experience. So going over some common food triggers, particularly in times of flare-ups, but might also be in times of remission as well. The first being insoluble fiber, which is a really bulky type of fiber. And so for some people, it's quite hard to break down, might increase number of bowel movements, cause looser bowel movements, more urgency, or potentially more pain in some individuals. And this type of fiber is primarily concentrated in the skins, peels, and seeds of fruits and veggies, as well as whole grains and whole nuts and seeds. Lactose is another very common trigger, particularly those who have active disease in their small intestine or have had resections of their small intestine. But definitely, genetics can play a role as well. Same with aging. As people age, generally tolerance to lactose, the type of sugar found in dairy, that might decrease as well with aging. Caffeine is another very common trigger because it is a gut stimulant, so found in in caffeinated teas or coffee, certain types of pop. So many people might find they do better with more herbal teas or like something like decaf coffee. Although I do want to mention that decaf coffee might also trigger symptoms in some people because it's rich in an acid called cholinergic acid, which is also a stimulant of the bowel. So it might be better than caffeinated coffee, but some people might still have symptoms from decaf coffee. Spicy foods are also a very common trigger, but we're really talking about ones that are rich in capsaicin, so primarily found in chili pepper and cayenne pepper. Ones like turmeric or coriander or cumin, those ones are generally pretty well tolerated. Alcohol is obviously another really common one. Some people might find the higher alcohol content drinks more problematic than ones like wine or beer. But then certain people might find that something like carbonation might make symptoms worse, or added sugars might as well. So it's not just the alcohol content being a gut irritant and stimulant. It might be about what else is in that beverage as well. All right, and then fatty foods, so things like chips, donuts, deep fried foods, those cause stronger contractions of the bowel after you eat. So might cause more bowel movements or more pain for some people after meals. Sugar alcohols might also increase symptoms, particularly things like diarrhea or bloating or gas. Those you might find in things like sugar-free gums or candies or certain types of like energy or protein bars. And they end with the all, so sorbitol, xylitol, maltitol, mannitol. But they can actually also be occurring naturally in some types of fruits and veggies and foods as well, but usually much smaller amounts than what you'd find in processed foods. And then lastly here, sugary foods and fluids can also drive symptoms. They do draw more fluid into the bowel, which might cause more frequent, looser bowel movements. I do want to mention a few things about these triggers though. So some people do find it's very portion dependent. So someone might do okay with something like a side salad versus a large entree size salad might really push them over the edge and getting a lot of symptoms. So it might be portion dependent on how often you consume that food. Tolerance can also change over time, especially between times of remission and flare up. So if you're currently restricting foods in a flare and then you enter into remission, it might be worthwhile thinking about if there are particular foods you're missing in your diet or that you would really enjoy having, and consider retesting those, even if it's starting with just very small amounts of those foods. And then lastly, I do want to mention that just because someone might get symptoms after having a food doesn't necessarily mean that food is causing inflammation. So if we take something like leafy greens or like a salad, for some people that might cause a lot of uncomfortable symptoms, but that is actually an anti-inflammatory type of food. So symptoms in that case likely do not correspond with an increase in inflammation. Whereas something like processed meats is something that might produce symptoms, and it also might be inflammatory if consumed in large amounts on a very regular basis. All right, so next we're going to talk about some strategies to optimize nutrition. So one thing I do often review with people is meal timing and spacing. I do find most people tend to do better in flares with smaller, more frequent meals, which might mean 4 or 5 meals spread out throughout the day rather than 3 large meals. For some people, though, that can be quite overwhelming, figuring out like timing-wise when to fit those in, or like figuring out what to eat at all those different times. And so if having less eating times is more helpful for you, I try to suggest aiming to eat at least every 4 to 5 hours. So you're not going really long periods without eating, because that could really make it challenging to meet your nutrition needs, as well as if you fast for a long period and then you might eat like a larger meal, that in itself might cause more symptoms because meal size can make a difference for people. I don't know if anyone's curious about intermittent fasting, but that, aligns a little bit with what I'm talking about with fasting. For some people, if they're using it for specific things, say like weight loss or other reasons, might be beneficial for some people in certain scenarios. But from a symptomatic perspective, I often find it makes symptoms worse in a lot of cases, because it often does mean either eating less overall, which can make you more prone to becoming malnourished, or you might be eating the similar amount, but just in a shorter time frame, which is more likely to drive more GI symptoms. Pace of eating can also make a difference to symptoms and how well you digest food. Digestion does start in the mouth with not only mechanical breakdown, but we do also have enzymes in the mouth that kickstart digestion by breaking down starches. So if someone's eating really quickly, that might make them more prone to having more symptoms and food just not being as well digested as it moves through. One thing that I try to get patients to think about is maybe try not to multitask while eating, especially if it's things like watching TV while eating or working while eating, as a lot of us tend to be prone to eating really fast and mindlessly when we're doing other activities like that. All right, so including protein-rich foods is really important, especially in times of flare-ups, because protein needs are actually much higher in times of a flare compared to times of remission, and especially if absorption is impaired from having had resections or active inflammation in the small intestine. So I do try to encourage people to have a protein-rich food with every meal, and ideally snacks as well, whether that is animal protein like meat, poultry, or fish, dairy products, which could be lactose-free products if needed, if those are better tolerated, or various plant-based proteins like legumes, nuts and seeds, or soy products like tofu or tempeh or edamame. All right, so something else that can help in certain scenarios is adding sources of soluble fiber. So unlike insoluble fiber, I mentioned that's kind of the bulky type of fiber that's tough to break down in seeds and skins and peels. Soluble fiber is a softer fiber, and when it comes into contact with water, it's quite viscous in certain cases and gels up, which can slow down the transit of stool in the bowel, so it might be helpful for diarrhea. And it can also actually help with constipation in some cases, because it keeps stools soft and keeps them moving if someone's really prone to having hard, dried out stools. And so particularly rich dietary sources of soluble fiber would be things like bananas, oranges, avocado, oatmeal, barley, beans, ground flax seeds, and chia seeds. You may also be familiar with soluble fiber supplements like Metamucil or psyllium husk. So those are quite a concentrated source of soluble fiber. It really thickens up, as I'm sure many of you would know if you tried it. Drinking a glass of Metamucil or psyllium, it's quite thick and viscous. Capsules are an option though as well. So it's not always the easiest to take because it is so viscous, especially if you're taking it in powdered form, which is why another supplement called partially hydrolyzed guar gum, it's the type of fiber, might be better tolerated in some situations. And more common brands of that would be ones like Relief Fiber or Fiber 4. I do want to mention that if someone has stricturing or narrowing in their bowel, it is important to be mindful of things that are really viscous and thicken in the bowel. So I wouldn't suggest things like Metamucil or psyllium if there's narrowing, and definitely you have to be more careful about things like ground flax seeds or chia seeds, as those thicken quite a lot as well. All right, so nutrient-rich fluids is also something that could be considered, as some people do find it easier to manage fluids compared to foods in times of active symptoms. And if this is the case, I suggest trying to focus on having nourishing fluids like nutrient-rich soups or smoothies, bone broths, milk, lactose-free or plant-based if needed. And someone could always consider nutrition supplement drinks like Boost or Ensure, or a more recent supplement that's come on the market. It's called Sperry, which sometimes is a bit better tolerated by individuals. And at the end of this slide here, we have some commonly well-tolerated foods listed. So these are foods that are generally low in insoluble fiber, lean, and quite easy to digest. I want to mention that a lot of this information on these slides is on a handout on our website if anyone wants to have more of this information but not have to write everything down. And I'm with the IBD Centre of BC, so our website is ibdcenterbc.ca. You could always visit me at a booth for a pamphlet with that website address if you want. We do have a nutrition section on our website with various handouts, including a handout on nutrition during an IBD flare. So much of what is covered in today's session. All right, so next we'll move on to talking about managing hydration in a flare. So first off, it is really important to get adequate fluid during a flare to prevent dehydration, as well as support healing of the gut. Most people need around 2 to 2.5 liters of fluid per day, which is 8 to 10 cups, but needs can be quite variable and might change if someone has high output. So if someone has a lot of diarrhea or vomiting, high ostomy output, high fistula output, or if they're exercising a lot or sweating a lot, those things all increase fluid requirements. Commonly well-tolerated fluids do include things like plain water, herbal tea, and for some decaf coffee, bone broth, milk, maybe lactose-free if needed, as well as diluted juices. For those individuals having trouble maintaining hydration, especially if there are high fluid losses, like a lot of diarrhea, sometimes it can be hard to keep up with hydration with just those fluids I mentioned, as those are not necessarily the most optimal types of fluids for absorption, in which case something like an oral rehydration solution could come into play. So an oral rehydration solution combines a source of regular sugar with salt and water and potentially other electrolytes, all in very specific ratios to help optimize the absorption of the water in the small intestine so that less is coming out and running right through you or increasing outputs. Store-bought options that you may have seen at pharmacies do include ones like Hydralyte and Pedialyte, which can come in various forms, so powders, tablets, or like pre-made bottles of it. Another new product that you can see up here that's actually pretty new to Canada is called Liquid IV, and it's actually the cheapest option out of the 3 products I just mentioned, especially if you get it at Costco. They've just started carrying it. So that's another option for oral rehydration solution. I also have up here a recipe if someone wants to make their own, which is by far the cheapest way to have an oral rehydration solution. And this recipe is on the handout on our website if anyone is interested in looking at it. But it does combine fluid, being water, with a source of sugar, either being table sugar or juice as a source of sugar. It adds salt. It adds a potassium supplement, which is typically found in the regular salt section at a grocery store. And then it has baking soda as an additional thing added to that. So that is an example of an oral rehydration solution recipe you could make on your own. And oral rehydration solutions are most effective if you sip them slowly between meals. You wouldn't want to have a whole cup really quickly all at one time. That's going to not be the most optimally absorb. So best small sips spread out over a longer period of time, mostly between meals rather than with meals. Those tips can also apply to the other fluids you might be drinking, whether it's water or other fluids. You might do better with them mostly between meals and sipping them slowly rather than quickly with meals, especially if you're more prone to bowel symptoms soon after a meal. In terms of other hydration drinks, you may have heard of ones like BioSteel and Gatorade. They're definitely popular products on the market. They're not considered oral rehydration solutions though, although for some people they might be better than water because they are giving you a source of electrolytes to replete those that might have been lost. BioSteel is not considered an oral rehydration drink because it doesn't have regular sugar in it. And then Gatorade is not considered an oral rehydration. It's actually too high in sugar to be considered an oral rehydration drink. But if someone is choosing Gatorade, I usually suggest the lower sugar Gatorade, the G2 Gatorade, so you're not getting as much sugar as the regular Gatorade. And then lastly, I do want to mention if someone's making their own hydration drink, it's definitely not as palatable sometimes as the store-bought options because some of the store-bought options, especially Pedialyte being one of them, typically do have artificial sweeteners in them, which can really mask the flavor of the salt and other electrolytes added to them. Hydrolyte and Liquid IV don't use those artificial sweeteners. But yeah, if someone's making their own drink, you could theoretically, if you want, add like Mio drops or Crystal Light to like mask the flavoring of the electrolytes if those are interfering with you drinking them. Not necessarily the best thing to do from an inflammatory perspective if you're having them on a daily basis long term, but certainly if it helps you to drink them, hydration is the more immediate concern. So that definitely is an option if that helps someone with the palatability of these drinks. All right, so I'm just going to briefly run through some popular diets for IBD. As sometimes patients do like to experiment with these in flare-ups or even sometimes in times of remission to help prolong periods of remission. And you may have heard of some of these diets, some of the more common ones being the Crohn's disease exclusion diet or the CD/ED diet, the specific carbohydrate diet, the IBD anti-inflammatory diet, and the low FODMAP diet. So for some people, specialized diets like these I just mentioned may be really helpful in certain scenarios, but I think they should be used with caution because they do restrict a lot of different types of foods, which can not only make it challenging to meet your nutrition needs, but can also in some cases interfere with someone's relationship with their body, as well as food. And we do actually know that the rates of like eating disorders and disorder eating are actually fairly high in the IBD population. And following restrictive diets might put someone at increased risk of those things. It's not necessarily given, but if someone's on one that's very like a long-term thing for them and it's really interfering with their quality of life and psychosocial functioning, liberalizing might be something to consider. And so for these reasons, I do suggest whenever possible trying to work one-on-one with a dietitian if you really want individualized guidance for what type of diet, if any, might be appropriate for you and how to go about the various stages of it. Because oftentimes these diets have multiple stages. So for instance, the low FODMAP diet, there is a period of restriction, usually like 4 to 8 weeks, but then it's not meant to be followed long term. There is a challenge, like reintroduction phase, to help you figure out specific food triggers in the hopes of eventually liberalizing your diet as much as possible while still controlling symptoms. Now, just like Laura was talking about this morning in her presentation about the Mediterranean diet, that is the dietary pattern that I tend to recommend most for my patients, because it is a pretty well-balanced diet that gives you a variety of nutrients as well as helps to manage issues outside of the gut as well. It's a general good diet for overall health. It's really rich in fruits and veggies, legumes, nuts and seeds, olive oil, and allows some amounts of dairy and animal protein, processed foods, but in less amounts than those other types of foods. It also takes into account lifestyle things like trying to increase exercise and eating with other people at meals. The next slide shows the IBD food pyramid, which is sometimes something that I show patients. It's really based off of the Mediterranean diet with some other considerations as well. This handout is actually at the booth I have outside. So if anyone wants a physical copy of this handout and you don't have it already, you can always come by my booth. But a few things to mention here. So on the right-hand side, it does mention a list of food additives you find in processed foods that might increase inflammation. So those would be ones like maltodextrin or carrageenan, carboxymethylcellulose. But what we're really concerned about is regular consumption of those things. So say if anyone likes Ernest ice cream here, Ernest ice cream, unfortunately, a lot of their ice creams do have carrageenan in them. But if someone really wants to have Ernest ice cream, once in a while as a treat, not a problem in most cases. It's more about if someone liked Ernest ice cream and had a huge bowl every day, day in and out for your years, that might be something that could potentially increase inflammation and might increase their chance of flaring in the future. So it's really about regular consumption in larger amounts, not the one-off or the occasional thing. This pyramid also highlights the importance of omega-3 fats. So found in things like fatty fish, so, salmon, trout, mackerel, herring, or sardines, or plant-based foods like walnuts or chia, hemp, ground flax. And there's definitely some research particularly suggesting intake of fatty fish in colitis to help with reducing inflammation. Supplements are an option if needed, but the research is not showing benefit from an inflammatory perspective with supplements. It's really more the fatty fish. And then definitely trying to limit intake of trans fats, high intake of saturated fats, and for oils, mostly tending towards avocado oil or olive oil being the primary types of oils that I suggest using most often. All right, so I'll go over briefly some supplement recommendations that I do sometimes suggest to patients. So, these could include nutrition supplements as well, like Boost, Ensure, or Sperry, which I mentioned earlier. But this could also include more supplements you'd find, kind of the vitamin section in a pharmacy or a store. So, a multivitamin mineral supplement is usually something that I pretty standardly recommend in times of flare-up and sometimes in times of remission as well, especially if someone's diet is limited in variety. Generally, if someone can tolerate the whole capsules or pills that you swallow or chewable tablets, those are preferable to gummies, as gummy options are not generally quite as complete in the variety of vitamins and minerals they have. If someone has narrowing in their bowel, though, I do suggest the versions that break down. So ideally, a chewable tablet if possible, if someone has narrowing in their bowel. Vitamin D is another really common one that I suggest to pretty much every patient I come into contact with. We do know that a lot of people with IBD have low vitamin D levels if they're not on regular vitamin D supplementation. And low vitamin D levels can actually worsen inflammation in the gut. So we do really want to try to normalize vitamin D as much as we can. And this could be from a liquid vitamin D supplement or tablets, really whatever form is preferable to you. All are effective in most individuals. In certain scenarios, someone might need a very high dose prescription vitamin D supplement if their levels are quite low despite regular supplementation. And because, we do get some sun exposure in the summer here, for some people it's not absolutely essential to be taking it in really sunny months. So anywhere from kind of like May to September. But I usually suggest at least having a supplement during October to March or April in Vancouver when we're not getting a lot of sun exposure. Fish or algae oil are also common supplements I recommend because they are sources of omega-3 fats. But I usually only suggest them if someone can't get enough omega-3 fats from food sources, because foods are preferable when possible. And like I mentioned just a moment ago, there might be some more benefit from an inflammatory perspective to foods versus supplements. So they're kind of a backup option, definitely a good option if that's the most realistic way for you to get omega-3 fats. And I put algae on there as well, just because, for vegans or people not wanting fish, algae is also a good source of omega-3 fats. All right, so other than those things, calcium is another one that I commonly recommend to people. I guess of all the nutrients, when I look at someone's diet, I think calcium is one of the more common ones that's deficient in a lot of people's diets, particularly because I feel like dairy is a really common type of food to avoid or limit, and there aren't necessarily alternatives replaced in their diet in adequate amounts to give you enough calcium. Also, if someone's on steroids like budesonide or prednisone, those medications increase calcium needs. So, oftentimes I do suggest looking at dietary approaches first. Could someone increase their intake of cow's dairy products like milk, cheese, yogurt, kefir, or lactose-free options if needed, or exploring the plant-based options. There's so many different types of plant-based milks and yogurts out there these days. But I do suggest, when possible, trying to look at the ingredients list to see if they've been fortified with calcium, because not all products are fortified with calcium. And then some people might need vitamin B12 supplements if their levels are quite low. So this would particularly be the case if someone has had a resection of the last part of their small intestine, the terminal ileum, where vitamin B12 is absorbed, or if they have active inflammation in that area. Other situations where someone might need supplements is if someone's on a more like plant-based diet. That's going to be a diet lower in vitamin B12. As well as Health Canada actually recommends everyone over the age of 50 get a supplemental synthetic source of vitamin B12, because absorption drops after the age of 50 as stomach acid levels decrease. That makes cleaving vitamin B12 from food not as effective. And so after the age of 50, only a very small dose is needed, more than what would be provided by a multivitamin or mineral supplement. But yeah, those would all be situations where someone might need a supplement, whether that's one that you swallow or a sublingual one that goes under your tongue, or some of you might have had to have vitamin B12 injections on a regular basis if oral options are not enough to maintain levels. And then a few other supplements that I sometimes suggest. So one would be ginger if someone has nausea. Various forms of that are obviously available, whether that's, fresh ginger you're adding to cooking or making ginger tea, or using ginger capsules as well could be an option. Curcumin is one that I often get asked about, which there is a little bit of research looking at its use for both Crohn's and colitis, and it might be potentially beneficial. A lot of the products on the market, though, are quite low doses of curcumin compared to what's been used in research. So we don't really know whether taking a very low dose would have the same or enough benefit compared to the high doses that have been used in research, but those might potentially be anti-inflammatory. Peppermint oil is also one that's sometimes used, especially if someone's having a lot of pain or spasms in the bowel after meals. A few of the common brands of that would be ones like IBGuard or Pepogest. And they're different from, say, just like peppermint oil that you'd swallow, because they're enteric coated, meaning that they don't break down until they reach their target location in the small intestine. So they're not as like acid reflux inducing, and they actually reach that target location where they can relax the muscles of the bowel to try and help reduce pain after meals. Probiotics are another thing that I really regularly get asked about a lot. And at this point in time, I mean, not all probiotics have been studied for colitis and Crohn's, but of the ones that have been studied, there have been some shown to be beneficial for colitis from an inflammatory and potentially symptom perspective. Unfortunately, we're not at that point for Crohn's. We don't have any specific probiotic recommendations for Crohn's right now, but that might change over time as more research is done. There are some specific probiotics as well for if someone has a J pouch and has issues with pouchitis. So other than evidence-based probiotics for pouchitis and ulcerative colitis, certain scenarios might warrant trying a probiotic, like if someone's on antibiotics and having a lot of diarrhea, or if someone's in remission, so there's no active inflammation, but if they have very active symptoms or if they've been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, there are some probiotics that have some evidence for helping those conditions. Sometimes it can be a bit of a like trial and error process though for patients, going through a few different types to see if they notice any benefit. It might take time to really notice the benefits, potentially weeks or a month before someone notices a difference in symptoms. And then I do want to mention that if someone does feel really well on a probiotic, it actually, usually the probiotic only continues to be beneficial if you're taking it. Once you stop taking the probiotic, generally the gut microbiome reverts back to what it was prior to starting the probiotic. So for lasting benefit, if it's helping your symptoms, usually it would require taking it, continuously longer term. This resource I put on here, which is a really good evidence-based guide for probiotics. They have a website called probioticchart.ca. They also have an app both for Androids and iPhones if you're looking it up, called Probiotic Guide Canada. It's a team of clinicians, including pharmacists, who are regularly scanning the literature to see what new research is coming out. And they've put together this evidence-based guide showing what probiotics have evidence for helping what conditions. So on the app so far, you'll see conditions listed like colitis and pouchitis and antibiotic-associated diarrhea, but you won't see Crohn's yet on this app because there's no evidence-based probiotics yet. But again, that might change over time. All right, and then lastly, going over some non-dietary strategies someone could try if dietary approaches aren't helping enough, or if they prefer starting out with non-dietary approaches. Because obviously beyond diet, there are other things that can impact symptoms, and inflammation, like stress, sleep, and physical activity. So some things that might be helpful for some people would be things like mindfulness or meditation, yoga, CBT, or gut-directed hypnotherapy. So hypnotherapy, it's not the type of hypnotherapy you'd see on a stage show where someone seems out of it and the person's making them do all sorts of crazy things. It's really more of like a guided meditation that helps you focus on sensations in your gut and relaxing the gut to try to control symptoms. And there's a very specific approach to doing gut-directed hypnotherapy, which could be offered in person by certain trained practitioners, including there are a few in Vancouver. And then there are also a few app options as well, if someone wanted to try hypnotherapy wherever they are. So Nerva is one of the more popular apps. It is a paid subscription. And then there is also Zemity, which has a few recordings for hypnotherapy, and it's a free option. So not quite as comprehensive as Nerva, but is a free option if anyone wants to try it out without any financial commitment. All right, and then lastly, just want to go over a few resources. So I mentioned on the IBD Center website, there are some handouts and resources and articles, including the ones listed on this slide here. So nutrition tips during an IBD flare, nourishing liquids for soup and smoothie recipe ideas, a low in soluble fiber diet if that's needed for someone who has more active diarrhea or has narrowing in their bowel. There are recipes that are low in insoluble fiber, and then there's a food and symptoms log as well, amongst other types of articles looking at things like dairy and curcumin, prebiotics, probiotics. So if you want more information, feel free to browse our website. All right, so that brings us to the end of the presentation. And I just want to open the floor if there are any questions that anyone has here.